Hello, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to Tasha's Tales. Today's guest is. I've lost it. Should I have not done this before?
What do you mean you've not done this before?
Don't know. Um, I feel like this is going to go terribly wrong.
No, it won't go terribly wrong. It'll
Okay,
take a little bit of
okay,
time to start off with, but
okay. Let's go. Hello, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to Tasha's Tales. Today's guest is a brother from another mother of mine. It's a cousin, it's a chuddy buddy of mine, and someone who I've known my whole entire life. And it's really, really nice to be doing this with you, Khurram. Would you like to introduce yourself?
yeah, that's how my name's Kurum. Obviously, as you've introduced me. We're cousins. Your dad is my mum's brother. So we go all the way back. So I've known you your whole life. You've not known me the whole of mine. But yeah, we obviously have numerous shared commonalities between us being family and common interests and common talking points. Since you moved to England way back when, we've
Uh,
been in
2002.
Yeah, kind of been visiting you and there, and then the family network has grown in the UK, and obviously been listening to your podcast with interest to hear the various topics. A lot that strike close to home when you were interviewing your mum, and then also speaking to your dad, part of my mum. That was interesting. But yeah, been very impressed with what you're doing, and I think that's where we've got ourselves to where we have today.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And you were one of the very few people at the beginning who gave me constructive criticism rather than just saying, yeah, yeah, it's good, crack on with it. So it was really helpful. I appreciate you and your support. And actually, I got a message from your missus
Did you?
last week to say that she listened to an episode and really enjoyed it, which really touched my heart. So I appreciate you guys a lot. I'm
That's
really
good to
glad
hear.
that we go the extra mile and keep in touch and whatnot.
Yeah, it can be
Um,
difficult these days, but yeah.
this is the first time we're having a serious conversation, and I'm
I
a
know, because normally we have very jokey sort of family get-togethers, Eid and weddings and other sort of maybe more somber occasions, but it was always a laugh and a joke and making fun of each other, calling each other names. I suppose that's what happens when you've known each other since you were kids. So yeah, probably one of. I mean, we do have serious chats, but not in a sort of organized format. They just kind of get into serious chats just naturally, I guess, more than
and they do
anything.
and they don't last very long. Like I know we have serious conversations, but since becoming parents, it's just utter chaos, isn't it? Or it
Yeah,
has been the
yep,
last few times.
yep.
So yeah, I am nervous, I'm not gonna lie.
No, I can
However,
understand why, because obviously this is a serious topic that we've decided to discuss. So obviously, yeah, it is a bit. I think nerves are good because it shows it's something that you care about, something that's important, and something that you want to do properly and do justice to, given the subject matter. Which I think. Do you want to introduce what we're going to be talking about, or would you like me
yeah,
to do it?
no, I want to just mention the fact that I have historically some of the episodes. So I did one with my friend Emma where we did talk about Palestine. And
Hmm.
then my lovely friend James, he mentioned Palestine himself during one of the episodes. And whilst I have mentioned Palestine in a couple of, or 2 to 3 episodes of mine, I've just brushed over the topic rather than getting into it or delving into it because I myself don't feel comfortable and confident to have that conversation. And that's when you came in and you offered to do that. And, I'm extremely grateful that you are taking the lead on this, really. And yeah, appreciate it. So if you want to introduce.
Yeah, I mean, I think we both acknowledge that this is a sort of broad subject matter. It's one that has a lot of worldwide experts and a lot of emotion behind it as well, and therefore there is a variety of narratives, there is a variety of facts, and therefore people often can feel uncomfortable when they're questioned about it if they don't have the knowledge or the understanding. I mean, people have spent their lives studying the history of the region, where the Middle East, Palestine, and the Arabian Peninsula around it, and the claims to it, theological and non-theological. So therefore, it's always something that people can be a bit nervous to talk about. But I think you and I, when we were talking about it originally, one of the purpose of this discussion to be sort of manifold. You've obviously been doing bits and pieces in terms of raising awareness of the Palestinian cause since the attacks of 7th of October 2023 and the aftermath. I think that's when it came back into the spotlight of the global media. But it's obviously something that's been going on for a lot longer than that. And, you've been going to your protests and doing things of that nature. And we've discussed it and spoken from sort of very clear, I'll use the words partisan perspective, in the sense that, we try and stay objective, but to us, the Palestinian cause is not something that's objective to us. I mean, the earliest I can think about it is when we were kids, sort of first generation born immigrants in the UK. It was always, send money to the Palestinian people. And the things that I'd see on TV would be people like Yasser Arafat and his sort of scarf and, going towards the sort of negotiations. And the earliest memory I've got is probably the Camp David discussions that were had, like with Bill Clinton over in the States, with Yasser Arafat being there. And that was the image that I always had. But obviously it's something that, got us both thinking, in terms of that there's a lot of people out there who have become impassioned about the cause by seeing, well, the abhorrent things that we've been seeing on TV and reading about. And obviously to some people, it's the first time they've come across this, maybe because of age, maybe because of the first time they're seeing the media giving it spotlight and attention. But often what ends up happening is that when people go on to protests or debates or discuss with other people, they find that they're not actually too well versed with the history behind it, why it's happened. And often their narrative is molded by what we see in the media. And I think given today's day and age, as we've seen, obviously there's the craze of everyone calling everything out as fake news. It's difficult to always tell what's the reality and what isn't. And I think for me, I was quite lucky in the sense that whilst I've had the cultural background of, as being Muslims, we focus in on the religious aspect of Palestine, and therefore we were educated to some extent, very limited extent, as to what's going on there. And therefore we've got that element. But I was quite lucky in the sense that as part of my sort of secondary school education, we did a lot on the, as they called it back then, the Arab-Israeli conflict. And that's when I really started to understand the history behind it and understand the sort of various nuances. And I think the primary point that I think we want to make before I think we say anything about it is that neither of us are experts. I mean, I definitely am not an expert, but I feel that a lot of people come out claiming to be experts and say things that they haven't researched, haven't checked, and often just aren't even true. And therefore, whilst not understanding the context or, knowing everything about it, people make lofty claims. And I think it's good for people to always develop their understanding and go beyond that. So I think that was our purpose behind having this discussion. I think the other point to make out is that whilst we obviously do have a stance and a sort of leaning towards a certain, in inverted commas, side, I think we still have to be objective. And we're not being here to defend anyone or defend anything other than beyond what is fundamentally a humanitarian point, with some leaning towards obviously our own beliefs and culture and things of that nature. So I think that's the other point I want to make clear, is that we're not here to target any group of people. We're not here to focus in on saying the blame lies with X person, Y person, or Z person. I think it's more a case of the facts are the facts. And, in all sorts of conflicts like this, whether it be the Palestinian conflict, whether it be something, elsewhere in the world, the loss of human life, when it can be avoided, should be avoided. And I think that's where all of us, most likely your audience, obviously, would come from and want to make sure that they can do something to preserve life and make sure that humanitarian causes are furthered and strengthened. So with that spiel, I suppose, get to the point. I don't know if you wanted to say something just then.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really, really helpful. I love the way you've given an insight into your own personal journey. I think in some ways, the existence of social media has been a positive one, in the sense that a lot of people have come to know about what's happening in the region, and it's unavoidable. And I think, like you said, the point of it being a humanity crisis, I think you can't shy away from that.
No.
That is just facts. And on that note, let's make a start. I think it's best to go back to the history, right? To make sense of
Yeah,
what's happening and why it's
I
happening.
think Yeah, I think that's the first point, right? I mean, for most people looking at this, the question will be, well, why are these people fighting? What is the point behind it? Why is there such a dispute? Where's all this come from? And I think fundamentally you have to look at this. And I know a lot of people blame religion for a lot of things, but it is always termed, and when people always talk about Israel and the region and Palestine and Jerusalem, it is known as the Holy Land, and it's known as the Holy Land for a variety of different reasons. There are claims made to Jerusalem and importance of Jerusalem by the three monotheistic faiths of the world. So that's Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. They all make a claim to certain things that have happened, certain events and certain historical and theological events that have all happened within that region. And therefore they cherish it, and it means a lot to them. And therefore they all feel that they've got some sort of claim towards it. And, throughout time and throughout history, for, one group of people or another, there've always been claims to it. Now, Jerusalem, I think, goes way back to 3000 BC. Obviously, the Christians have a claim or hold Jerusalem dear to themselves because the life of Christ was predominantly through the course of in Jerusalem. I know it was Jesus of Nazareth, but at the same time, he was considered to spend the majority of his life and do all of his teachings in Jerusalem. From the Jewish perspective, from my understanding anyway, whilst there's not explicit references to Jerusalem itself, there are references to where the origins of their faith are, what there has been for mentions of it within their holy books and things of that nature. Islamically, well, so again, going back to the Jewish point, it's the direction towards which Jews pray. Outside of Jerusalem, they pray towards it. The mention of Jerusalem appears in the Hebrew Bible, and also there's mention of the place of Zion, which is considered to mean Jerusalem, that appears there. And in Islam, obviously, I say obviously because you and I both know, obviously it's the third holiest city after Mecca, Medina. It was originally the first point of direction for Muslims to pray towards as well. And it's considered the site upon which the Prophet, peace be upon him, traveled spiritually, physically, and otherwise. And it's Islamically, the belief is that the Prophet traveled in one night from Mecca to Jerusalem and then up towards the heavens where he met with the other prophets as well, and was given divine indication in terms of the amount of times that Muslims would pray in a day and other rites and rituals of the Islamic faith, basically. So therefore, that is the site there is in Jerusalem, and therefore to Muslims, that's why they hold it so dear, and there's many claims to it. And that's fundamentally, that's where the origin of why people, the three biggest faiths, lay such a claim, and why it's so important, and why it is the Holy Land to so many different faiths. And that's where the original sentiment comes on. Because obviously people could turn around and say, well, why can't people just move? Is it a cultural thing? Is it a historical thing? What is it? Well, the first point is it's a theological point. It's theological in terms of where the claim lies for the various faiths. Now, looking at the actual history itself, as in stepping aside from the theology, because that is, some people might say, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in any of these religions, so therefore these people are completely stupid. Why are they fighting over something that is just purely religious? So then I think you then have to focus in on the actual chronological history in terms of what happened to the land, who owned, in inverted commas, who owned the land, what happened there, and everything that follows thereafter. So everyone kind of focused in on two sort of key dates, two key years, 1967 and 1948, and then pre-1948, pre-1967, and post-1967. Now, the reason behind that is if you look at pre-1948, now 1948, everyone always talks about the Nakba, the catastrophe, when there was mass displacement of the Palestinian indigenous people. Some people will dispute whether or not they were indigenous, but as far as I'm concerned, indigenous people, they will dispute as to what happened there. But so pre-1948, the Palestinian, so from 1948, there was the Nakba, which is the displacement. So prior to 1948, obviously, we're talking about the periods of the First World War and the Second World War. Up and including to the First World War, the Ottomans ruled the majority of what is modern day Israel and Jerusalem. So it was part of their empire. Now, First World War time, there was a lot of different empires all laying claims to different lands. There was the British Empire, there was the German Empire, and there was the French Empire. Now, if you look at the historical impact of these empires, they all wanted to amass as much land and resources as they could. And there was obviously a lot of dispute between the various empires, and the Ottoman, being one of the strongest ones, was disputed by the Western powers, as it were. And they wanted to break this up through, competition, as it were, between different governments and different entities, really. At the same time, there was what kind of sparked across Europe was the starting of the Zionist movement. Now, everyone talks about Zionism today, saying, I've got nothing against Jews. It's Zionists that I have a problem with. I've got nothing against Israelis. It's Zionists I've got a problem with. But people, I don't think, fully understand where Zionism came from and what it is. I mean, if I were to ask you, what would you basically say Zionism is. It's a tricky question to answer, right? It's just a term that we would say is people that want to displace Palestinians.
Yeah, that's
At
what
the
essentially kind of that supremacy, that mindset of we're better than you is kind of what comes to mind when you speak to people. But I guess I'm pleased that you're talking about the history of Zionism and how it came to light.
Well, I think this is it's important because at the moment none of this kind of relates to October 7th at all. Like someone listening in now will be saying, well, what's that got to do with October 7th? But it all does lead into it because the reason it's got to where it's got to is it's a buildup of anger. It's a deep rooted feeling of injustice. It's a deep feeling of claim to the land. And you've got to understand, where does that claim come from? Because if you don't understand it, then I mean, it's the classic phrase, right? Seek to understand before you can be understood. So if you don't understand it, how can you make any sort of points behind it? So I think it's very important to kind of unravel it and go back to the beginning, because it might be a bit boring, and I've trying not to make it into a history lesson, but at the same time, it's important to understand where it comes from. And people use the term Zionism, and it's important to understand what it is. And Zionism itself it's an ethnic, cultural, nationalist movement that emerged in Europe in the late 1800s. And the point behind it was that it was to establish a Jewish state through the colonization of a land that would be outside of Europe. So the term Zionism, I think it first appeared in around about the late 1800s, and it was by a Viennese writer called Nathan Birnbaum. And he kind of was the first person that I'm aware of that started talking about it. But then the prominence of it in terms of how we've probably heard of it, and you've heard of it probably through the various music, the various statements and the various lyrics that people use, was Theodor Herzl, who was an Austrian-Hungarian Jewish journalist, lawyer, writer of the time. And he was declaring his vision of actually founding a future independent Jewish state during the early 1900s. Now, they kind of obviously went through various, back in those times, obviously, it was through writing, through publishing of magazines, through publishing of newspapers and things of that nature. And it would take a lot longer to kind of establish these ideologies and how things would develop and, you know, what they could focus on. But they eventually focused on the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, the region that now corresponds to the land of Israel as they sit in Judaism, and which holds, obviously, as we've discussed, central importance in Jewish history. Now, Zionists wanted, as I understand it, wanted to create a Jewish state in Palestine with as much land as they could get their hands on, with as many ethnic and religious Jews as possible, and to be blunt about it, and as few Palestinian Arabs as possible. And since 1948, when the State of Israel was established, Zionism is considered to be the ideology that supports the protection and development of Israel as a Jewish state. And that often leads to the arguments that people make of it being an apartheid state, is the fact that Zionism and Israel go hand in hand. And that's what creates the sort of imbalance in apartheid state that you currently have. That's where we've got to pre-1948. You have this ideology, you have this movement, and the basis of actually forming a Jewish homeland in Palestine and to consolidate it from there. Now, that was the intention. Now, at the same time, there's various bits and pieces that you can research about. I mean, we have to be honest about it. In Europe, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. There always had been. I mean, you look back at writings and how the European Jew has been portrayed. It's absolutely, I mean, there's no way around it. It's been awful in terms of the way they've portrayed. There always were cartoons about them as people that couldn't be trusted, and that they'd keep themselves to themselves and look to influence the various economic scopes of the world, particularly in Europe. So they'd be money lenders. I mean, the classic example is Merchant of Venice, Shylock within that writing. So Shakespeare obviously had it there. So there was generally a negative view of Jews, and there's various writings and there's various bits and pieces that people can read. And there was always the question as to what are we to do with the European Jew? And I'm saying that in terms of what are we to do with it, in the sense that political powers, governmental powers, they considered Jewish people to be a bit of a problem. I mean, that's fundamentally fact in terms of how they saw it. I mean, it's not nice, it's not pleasant.
In terms of in terms of where they would settle, am I right in thinking that in terms of where they would settle after the World War II?
Even before that, basically, they wanted to get rid of them. That's fundamentally the truth. There was, in terms of how we see today, that there's, I mean, the way that we could describe it is the way that in some sense, it's not in a direct comparison, but in some ways, how the UK government is now treating immigrants into this country in terms of whether they be illegal or otherwise. It was very much of that nature that I mean, I obviously don't hold that view, but it's the view that the Jew could not be trusted, that the Jews were conniving, that they were people that would be looking to cheat you, that you didn't want to be near them, you didn't want them in your. It was anti-Semitism was rife in, well, I say early in like late 1800s, early 1900 Europe. It was rife. It was everywhere. There were two groups of people fundamentally that they didn't want to associate with: communists and Jews. They were, unfortunately, the only comparison I can make is they were the modern day Muslim, basically, in terms of they were considered to be the people that you couldn't trust, that there was whisperings about, that they don't want to be here, they just want to use us, etc., etc. Very, very unpleasant. But that ironically aligned then with the aims that Zionism has, i.e., make a Jewish homeland and get rid of them. That's how they saw it. So that's often where you get the introduction of the 1917 Balfour Declaration. Now, everyone has heard about it, but how many people actually know what it said? How many people actually even read the declaration? And that's the point that I make in terms of you need to educate yourself on these sorts of things to understand how this all came about and who's responsible for this sort of scenario and why there is got to be some responsibility on other powers. So the Balfour Declaration was made by Arthur James Balfour, who was the Foreign Secretary of the time in 1917. And he made it to Lord Rothschild, who was one of the lords at the time as well. I've got the statement in front of me, but broadly to summarize it, it wasn't something long, but essentially saying that there's a declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, and that's the UK government holds support for that. At the time, going back to it wasn't even Her Majesty, it was His Majesty. His Majesty's government view with to favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home of the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of the object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. And then he signs it off with saying, I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. So from that, we've obviously got that the UK government is supporting the Zionist movement, their reasoning behind it and the intention behind it. My view, in terms of all the reading that I've done, is that they didn't like Jewish people. They didn't want them here. They didn't want them in Europe, and they wanted to basically get rid of them, in terms of, to put it bluntly. And it's very unkind, but that is how I think they saw it. And he was trying to make it clear that they're going to facilitate the objective of creating a Jewish homeland in the land of Palestine. But at the same time, nothing shall be done that may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So that statement there it's very loaded in the sense that it's saying that there will be a Jewish state, or they will support the formulation of a Jewish state in Palestine, but they would do it without it being at the cost of anyone who is non-Jewish within that state. Now, as we can see, as we'll get to, that never happened. But it was very much the case of that was his declaration, and he made it publicly. Well, I say publicly, it's now a public document that you can see. And it's quite controversial if you get to grips with it, because this was the time, the early 1900s, when a lot of these empires were breaking apart. And there was this introduction of the principle of self-determination, that people in different countries and people of different groups could determine themselves as to who they are, have their own country, and not be governed by an empire. Like, so for example, you and I, we're from part of that empire. Our parents were, our grandparents were. The whole point was that they would then be able to determine themselves. So it's a lot of this formulates itself from the empires that were of the previous times. This is where a lot of the problems that we can see originated from. So from there, we've had, obviously, just trying to keep on track without making it too historical. You've
No,
got the Balfour.
I think it's really helpful, because I think we get an insight into why the British Empire did have something to do with it. So when people say it's not our business, well, actually, if we look back, it is our business, because it's a part of history.
It is a part of history, but
Yeah.
it is our being, the British problem. It is a British problem because we have influence and we've had some impact as causing it, but we continue to have impact as well. That's the other point. It's not as though the British government and the British people have completely stepped away from any influence or any sort of involvement in it. There's a lot of things that we still do in terms of provision of arms, provision of support, and, as I'll get to, is provision of cover
Uh,
to allow them to do what they want to do.
And I think this is why the Balfour Declaration, I think this is why this document speaks volume, and I think we should familiarize ourselves with the document to have the confidence to be able to explain what it means and how it started.
Well, it's literally three paragraphs. It's that simple that people keep talking about this declaration thinking it's a long-winded document, but it really isn't. It's three paragraphs. And from that, you can read in between it, you can study it, you can try and understand why is it that the UK government wanted to support a Jewish state? Why is it that they've made that point about making it balanced for all faiths and religions and people that are already there? They already mentioned Palestine. So when everyone goes on and on saying, oh, there was no such thing as Palestine, well, you're basing the fact that you're saying on one hand, there is no Palestine, there was no Palestine, but at the same time, then you're relying upon a declaration that refers to a state of Palestine and accepting and acknowledging the fact that there are non-Jewish people living and settled within that region, within that country. Now, I think you also have to take this with a pinch of salt in the sense that back in the early 1900s, there were not the countries and states that we see them as we have nowadays. There were not clearly marked delineated borders. There were not clearly marked states or governments or elections or things of that nature. So to turn around and say, well, there was no state of Palestine because, they weren't as advanced as, say, the UK or the Great British government or Germany or Austria or France or Spain or Italy or any of those countries. That might be the case, but that's because they just governed things differently. They had tribes and they had people who were heads of tribes, and they'd have like a region that was headed up by another head of some tribe, and they'd be the people that they go to, they'd rely upon their elders. Their elders would tell them where the city limits are, where this limit is, where so and so lives, and where you can't say that, for example, you're talking about states and when they originated. I mean, if we're saying that the state of Israel was only formally founded in 1948, so can we argue that pre-1948 Israel didn't exist? Well, fundamentally, that's what we're saying, but an Israeli person would turn around and say, no, that was always the Holy Land. That was always our land. Well, if you take a step back, Jerusalem, Israel, whatever you want to call it, the wider area of land that holds all this importance was probably first settled in 3000 BCE. And the majority of its rule was under Ottoman rule. There was the Crusades. So if anything, you could argue that between them, I think, if I'm not wrong, 1800 years worth of rule was under Christian or Muslim rule. So therefore, what are we basing it upon? If you're basing it upon a religious text, and with all due respect to everyone's religious text, if someone tomorrow turned around and said, I'm finding a new religion which basically says my holy land is the United States of America, does that mean I'm entitled to settle myself in the USA and say everyone else there has no right and no claim to it? If I was to get a Western government, let's say I was to get Russia to make a declaration that it supports the founding of a new religious state in America, and they'll support the founding of that, but without any detriment to anyone who's non-part of this new religion, people would say I'm absolutely crazy. But in one sense, you can use the Balfour Declaration to your advantage in the sense that it obviously helped ignite the founding of Israel to some extent. But then at the same time, you can turn around and say, well, Palestine didn't exist pre-1948. Well, the document says otherwise.
Yeah.
So it's important to understand this, because a lot of people criticize the Balfour Declaration, and yeah, I'm with those people, because it clearly didn't deliver what it was meant to deliver, and it had ulterior motives. But at the same time, there's stuff in there that you can use to further strengthen an argument for the fact that the Palestinian state did exist. Now, from that, you've obviously got another document that people talk about, but it's not really a document as such. Well, it is a document, but it isn't a document. It's broader than that. It's the British Mandate. Now, post 1917, I think it was between 1922 and then obviously to 1948, the British administered rule for the League of Nations, which is now the modern day UN, to govern over the land that was Palestine, basically, and look after it. So they'd pushed out the Ottomans at this point. The Ottoman Empire had collapsed, effectively. And now Palestine was being run or governed under the British Mandate. At this time, there was a lot of, in Europe, you look at it, there was the World War, right? World War II was starting to formulate. There was a lot of concern between the Jewish communities as to what would happen to them. Many of them, from early point, could see what was going to happen, could see that they were under threat. They decided to emigrate to what was obviously Palestine. And there was an increase in Jewish immigration from Nazi persecution. And the locals, the Palestinian people at the time, were very much worried about what was happening. So they rebelled against the fact that against the British Mandate and Jewish immigration. They obviously were concerned, and it was something that was causing them, to be worried about what was happening to their homeland. And there's I mean, we talk about the October 7th massacres and everything happened. I mean, let's make it clear again, there is no defense for any sort of taking of innocent life under threat of terror, under threat of military rule, under threat of abuse in any way, shape, or form. So there's no doubt that what happened on October 7th was inexcusable. But we have to be objective here and understand the fact that that was not the first demonstration by either side of such brutality. There were, and there are reports, I mean, obviously they're a bit older now, of the violence that was prevalent in Palestine pre-1948 from Zionist groups, paramilitary groups. There's the documentary on Netflix, I think is Tantura, which talks about the massacres that happened in that village. It was a Palestinian village. There is another, the name
I
now
didn't know
escapes me.
about this Netflix. You haven't shared this with me before.
I don't know if it's UK Netflix. So you might have to use some sort of, and I'm not going to excuse it, but IP manipulation, IP addresses and whatever. But I think it's called Tantura. It's a village, and there was a massacre there at the time. And it's very interesting, the accusations that are being made by the Zionist paramilitary groups themselves. So people who were there and saw these atrocities and will claim that they weren't part of them, but that there was another person within the paramilitary group that was conducting them. And there's an absolutely abhorrent story, and I won't go into it because it's just not very nice. But the story of what was committed, strangely, someone in October 7th said, "Oh no, that happened during October 7th as well," and then turns out not to be true. And it was the classic sort of the one that we've all now heard of the beheading of babies. It was along those lines, as in something very abhorrent happened. They claimed it happened. Turned out that it didn't happen, and strangely, going back through history, it did happen, or at least that's what the physical accounts of people who were there happened in Tantura, in the village. So you question yourself. There is a lot of blood and there is a lot of violence that has been committed by both sides, inexcusably. But, this is the point, that there has to be something that happens as a result of all this in order to establish some sort of position whereby, we can protect human lives. But anyway, going back to the fact that at the time there was the Tantura massacre, and there was a massacre in April 1948, and it's known as the Deir Yassin massacre. Again, another village. Your listeners can obviously go and read about it. It's not very nice, but these things did happen, and you can't shy away from the fact that there were paramilitary groups going around doing things of that nature, and it just obviously wasn't pleasant. At this sort of time in sort of 1948, when we get towards the Nakba, all these things that happen, Jewish immigration into modern day Palestine, there was influx of Zionist groups, there was influx of paramilitary groups, there were more skirmishes, there was more rebellion, there was more sort of discontent with the British mandate, there was discontent with what was going on, a lot of concern about what would happen to people's rights to land, claims of land, because, there was no land registry back then in Palestine. There just wasn't. I mean, let's be honest about it. It's, oh, my grandfather owned that land. I mean, let's talk about it, you and I. When we go to Pakistan, it's always, this area of land belonged to my grandfather. I mean, how many disputes have we seen even amongst our family about rights to property? There's, it's the same thing. These countries were not developed enough that they had anything like that. It was just a case of, this has always been the farmland of my grandfather and his grandfather and his grandfather before that. So there was always concern, and that's what sort of led to more and more skirmishes. And eventually there was the Declaration of Independence on the 15th of May 1948 by Israel, at which point the UK had relinquished the British mandate, referred it back to the League of Nations to saying that they should, I think it was the United Nations at that point, I think it was in February of 1947, and they recommended that a two-state solution be established with Jerusalem under UN trusteeship. Now that was critical, because my view is, if at that time you did have a two-state solution with Jerusalem being under UN rule, because that is fundamentally part of a lot of the discontent even today, is Jerusalem. Who's in control of Jerusalem? Obviously now it's the capital of Israel. Well, I say the capital of Israel. It's not the capital of Israel, but it is considered to be akin to a capital of Israel in the sense of how important it is. How, for example, in recent times, 2017, Donald Trump moved the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So people are aware that even if they don't call it the capital, for all intents and purposes, it holds a very important position. So my view is, if they'd obviously done that at the time in 1947, February 1947, before the Nakba, there would have been probably, well, arguably, could there have been peace in our time? Who knows? But that would have been one of those things that could have happened at the time. So it was The Nakba then occurred, and obviously it was the largest displacement of Palestinian refugees. They were forced out of their land, some of them never to return. In fact, I think a majority never to return to that land. And obviously you can understand that if it's somewhere where you've been lived your entire life and all of a sudden you're no longer entitled to it. I mean, our experience, partition, I mean, you speak, if our grandparents were alive now, if we spoke to them about what happened in partition, when overnight they just have to up and leave their neighbours, their communities, never to go back again. I mean, you look at the Punjab, how many Sikhs had to move towards the Indian side of the Punjab, modern day Indian side of Punjab, and how many of them, still have would like
Yeah,
to go and visit places in Pakistani Punjab.
yeah, and I suppose in some ways it's close to our heart more so because of what's, the disputed territory in Kashmir and our forefathers.
Exactly.
You know, we know that it's happened to our ancestors not that long ago. So,
Exactly. I mean, I think that's the thing, right? Because maybe you and I struggle to some extent to understand it. I'm talking about our personal background. We struggle to understand it when we talk to parents. Because I mean, I can say for myself anyway, I don't have that same sort of heartfelt attachment to the places that they would have been displaced from because we were never there. So how do we know? But if it's things that they've always got memories of in terms of running around that sort of area as kids, playing in those sort of places as kids, then it's that the heart wants what the heart wants, right? So it kind of pulls on that. So obviously you can understand why there's still that deep rooted desire to return to their land from 1948. Then we've got the landmark point of 1967. And I think this is when we get close to basically where we are today, because 1948, you look at it, there was a lot of support from external governments, external powers to enable the establishment of, modern day, well, 1948 Israel. At the time, they were still controlled by Jordan, Lebanon, and various other countries in terms of there's various regions in Israel that you can read up about. I'm not going to go into the details, but the Golan Heights, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem. So Israel at that point had taken control of West Jerusalem. They didn't have control of East Jerusalem. So at that point, you can still see that even external Arab countries still understood the value and the affinity that they have towards Jerusalem, and they still valued it to the extent that despite the fact that the Palestinians couldn't keep control of it, they were going to, maintain control and at least form part of East Jerusalem. Then during that time between 1948 and 1967, there was a lot of ill will and ill feeling between Israel and the various countries that surround them and still surround them. Obviously, some of them they now have peace with. But those, so now, as I was saying, so between 1948 and 1967, there was a lot of poor relationships between the various Arab countries that surround Israel, those being Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Egypt. And what happened in 1967 was what is now known as the Six-Day War, purely because of how the time that it took. It was essentially, as I say, 6 days. And if memory serves correctly, it started off with Israel launching preemptive strikes against Egypt, and people can read about this. And the preemptive strikes took out Egypt's air force ability to strike back and ability to do, sort of launch any sort of attack on Israel. And as part of the Six-Day War, Israel then occupied in quite some sort of force the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. Now, if you look at those regions and you study the history of the 1967 Six-Day War, you'll understand why those points were so geographically important to Israel. Now, the other reason that this is so important is because it was the first show of might by Israel of their military force. So they'd gone from being a Zionist movement pre-1948 to skirmishes and having support of external governments to now being able to stand on their own 2 feet and have a military power that would intimidate and serve as a point to basically say to the rest of the Arab countries there that we're not to be messed with now. So it was kind of the point of no return. At that point, there was no sort of way whereby fighting between the countries would resolve anything. It would have to be come to the table. Otherwise, there'd just be constant conflict. Now, kind of the history then that followed after 1967 up until I'd say the 2000s, there's a variety of different things there. There was the establishment of the PLO, which was the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So that was Yasser Arafat and people that would support him. UN recognized them as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Yasser Arafat sort of obviously launched different campaigns for peace and, sort of re-establishment of Palestinian claims to land. Equally, the Israeli side, there seemed to be sort of various attempts at sort of reaching a common ground and trying to get towards, sort of a peaceful position. I mean, I think you'll have seen it. Particularly, I can remember even as a kid, there was always stuff on in the news about so and so going to the States, so and so coming from the States, variety of different presidents, prime ministers of Israel, and sort of it did seem to be that there was a time where it was getting quite close, but always the question I
Mhm.
think would fall upon Jerusalem, what would happen to Jerusalem, and it just wouldn't be in a way whereby anyone would be willing to accept it. And throughout that time, there was still the ongoing conflicts between people. And to some extent, you can understand that because the Palestinian people were just seeing injustice left, right, and center against them, the land being taken, people not really paying any attention, no sort of chance of peace, constantly being under occupation and rule.
And
So
they
there
didn't
was,
want a two-state. Ultimately, they said this is
I,
our state. We don't
I,
want a
I,
two-state.
I think at that point there was I think at that point, yeah, you're right. At that point, there was still a desire to see one state. But it's the point, I think the point that I'm making is that after 1967, there was no way that you weren't going to have a two-state solution. Even after 1948, there was obviously a clear desire, and a lot had been done by the various powers that be, the various empires, to make it in such a way whereby you have to have a two-state solution, or you have a one-state solution where all men are equal. But obviously, as we can talk about the apartheid, that's not going to happen anytime soon. There is an apartheid state in Israel. You can't deny it. There are two different standards of living of people that live. I'm not going to say side by side, but live in the same sort of area. You've got people who live one standard of life. I mean, you go into the West Bank. I've never been, but people have explained it to me. I've seen the pictures of it. That there's two different types of highway, one for Palestinian people and one for the settlers. And even then, I know this to be factually correct because I've spoken with people and I work with on a volunteer basis with people from the West Bank that there are differing degrees of freedom of movement. Certain Palestinians have certain colored license plates on their cars, which means they can move more freely. Others do not have those license plates and therefore cannot move as freely. So there is limitations even amongst the Palestinian people in terms of how much they can move.
And even when it comes down to education, they need
Oh,
to have
everything,
permission to go abroad. There
anything.
was when you mentioned the protests, there was a guy who was talking about his mother who died of cancer because she wasn't allowed treatment. She was refused treatment. So these people are angry. They're really, really
Yeah,
angry. And
but go on, go on.
again, when you talk about standard of living, they can, everything's controlled from the education to medical facilities to what goes in, what comes out. There isn't an airport in Palestine. If
There
you wanted
isn't.
to travel there, you would have to go to Tel Aviv
You do.
and then you would need to seek permission. So I think that in itself is quite black and white, really, isn't it? I don't think there's any grey areas when we.
Well, yeah, but that's why these are sort of the skirmishes between, as I say, between 1967 and to modern day happen. So people can read about them. There's the first Intifada, which was, acts of civil disobedient riots by Palestinians in the various Israeli occupied Palestinian territories. It was through frustration of the military occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And this goes way back when to 1987. It's just continued. There's been, sort of more controls, more inhumane treatment, more problematic treatment, just again and again and again. They're just downbeaten people, downtrodden. And the only thing they can say is, well, what do you want us to do? What would you have us do? Would you have us fight or just go quietly into the night? And they won't go quietly. And why should they? I mean, ultimately, I think pre-October 7th, and because obviously people now talk about the fact that there's very little left by way of hope, and they don't even see any basis of peace because of what's happened. There's not a single family in Palestine, in the Gaza Strip, and now arguably even the West Bank, because they've got relatives and people in Gaza who have not lost family members, neighbors, and things of that nature. So they've all had pretty recently horrific damage to their family and their loved ones. And it's well, how do you expect them now to come back to the table? It just won't happen at this point. It's all they ask for. And I think pre October 7th and pre the follow up, what's happened afterwards, if you said to a Palestinian, what is it you want? They'd say, I just want to live in peace. I just want to be able to have freedom of movement, be treated as a human being, be able to walk down the street, be able to visit places, be able to earn my own money, be able to vote in an election, to have a political representative, to be able to travel the world, to be able to live, bake, get bread when I want without fearing being accosted by someone in a military fatigues and saying, where are you going? I'm better than you. You don't have to listen to me. It's this constant feeling of control and being under military rule, which I think is we've seen exacerbated since then. And that's just gone on and on and on. I mean, and that it culminated obviously since recent times from the election of, well, this is where everyone goes back to now, saying that these were the problems. This is everything that's happened. Peace was going up and forward, up and down. Intifada, the first Intifada, the second Intifada, various rebellions, various riots, various things, various, inhumane treatment, human rights abuses, all these sorts of things. But then it culminated when the Palestinians obviously in Gaza held their first elections and elected Hamas into power. Now, we get told all the
I
times, I
was
mean,
about to come to that. I'm so glad you're going to mention it because,
well, this is the
when
most important because this is what leads us to modern day, right? So
yeah,
all of this stuff that I've said, which might be, and obviously if it has been boring, I can only say boring, but all of this history leads to this point in the sense that you have people who are politically motivated, but feel completely unempowered, unable to do anything. And then along come a group of people who arguably say that they want to establish a Palestinian state, they want liberation, and they're a resistance movement, and they're entitled. Their intention is to liberate the Palestinian people, and that's where we get to when they were elected. I think it was back in am I right in saying 2007, 2006, 2007? Around then was when
fairly
they had the
recent, right?
relatively recent. So it's the first sort of fundamental government, if you can call it that, within the Palestinian territories, but that being in Gaza. But you were saying, yeah, you're glad I brought it up because
Because now, like you said, modern day Palestine, Israel, everyone talks about Hamas and what they've done and
yeah,
how they've, attacked Israel. But I think, it's important to highlight the fact that, you know,
I think with all these things, right, and I think it's how we always talk about it. So the Hamas launched the October 7th attacks into Israel, into the music festival, into the Israeli kibbutz, which is, the sort of settlements that they have. There was a lot of anger leading up to that. Now, it's not excusable to do what they did. There's no excuse for that. But there was a lot of anger that led up to this. There were warnings to the various authorities that, look, what's going on is not going to help. There are things that are happening. There are things that are formulating. You have to be wary of what's going on. Now, when 2007, when Hamas did come to power and seized control of the Gaza Strip from a rival Palestinian group, Fatah. So there's obviously internal infightings as well between the Palestinian people as to who's right to lead us and who's right to do X, Y, and Z. Hamas it's an abbreviation. They call themselves I think it's loosely translated to the Islamic Resistance Movement. And they're considered to be particularly the paramilitary wing is considered to be a terrorist organization by the majority of governments. Now, I think you have to take everything. It's difficult to try and explain this because I don't want people to kind of misquote or misinterpret what I say or how I'm saying it. But I think you have to take a look at everything with a critical and analytical eye, because a lot of what we are fed in modern day is, a propaganda spin and things of that nature. Like now, I mean, the point that I would make to you is that what do you see in the Western media and Western governments? The first thing you're asked is, do you condemn Hamas? Now, I mean, what has that got
I,
to do with
I
anything?
mean, I feel quite passionate about this because I feel like I've been quite naive to how media portrays a lot of things, but mainly how Muslims are portrayed. In general,
Yeah,
I'm not even talking about, Hamas. I'm talking about Muslims in general.
yeah.
We are absolutely demonized.
Of
We are
course we are.
the worst people. We are all terrorists. And I think that narrative
It sticks.
it's an umbrella term, isn't it? So
Of course it is.
we
Like,
already are labeled as the terrorists. And when you delve a bit further, then obviously naturally Hamas, who are also, what I'm trying to say,
I do.
I
That they're
feel,
all So this is the point, right?
I feel
So,
it
and
heightens the anger
it's
and the
my
frustration.
question. My question to anyone would be as simple as this: what is the difference, right? Objectively, when someone looks at it, an Israeli soldier, a member of the IDF, in military fatigues, dressed up, causing some sort of human rights abuse, versus a paramilitary Hamas fighter dressed in equal military fatigues, but obviously wearing a Palestinian scarf, wearing the things that symbolize what the Western media has portrayed as, Muslim terrorist. He's got a gun. and he goes and commits some atrocity, right? Now, on the face of it, both are the same to me. If they've both committed, if taken an innocent life or committed a terrorist attack, an attack against someone in some way, shape, or form, they're both as bad as each other. But for some reason, it seems to be that the clinical member of the IDF, in the sense that he's been ordered to do so by some guy in a suit sitting in the Israeli houses of powers that be, versus some bearded guy with a scarf on his head, dustbin in his hand. All of a sudden, he's, no, 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 they can't fight, but the IDF guy can fight. Now, I'm not saying that the abuses or terrorist attacks or anything that they launch is acceptable, far from it. But what I'm saying is that you have to dig deeper than just the face of it saying that Hamas are terrorists and IDF are, they're the infantry of the Israeli government.
You know what? This might sound like a really dumb question or
Go
dumb
for it.
observation, but when I sit here and I'm not the brightest button in the room, when I, if food is being controlled, go into Palestine, right? So
Mm,
they're not getting the basic medical facilities. Majority, 80% of the region's been blown up.
yep.
Where are they supposedly getting their arms from? Like that's just a really basic,
Who, who,
simple
who, which
Hamas.
Hamas? Well, the Israeli government will argue they're getting them through the tunnels. There were tunnels through Egypt into Gaza, and that's where they're getting their things. And they'll argue that Iran are supplying them, and then they'll argue that there's various groups that are bringing it in through the sea, they're bringing it in through the ports, they're bringing it through X, Y, and Z, and all these sorts of things. Now, it's like, I mean, I've very much been molded by my education, right? So from when I was younger, I had a great history teacher, and he would always say to me that don't ever believe the first account that you're given. Don't ever believe the first report that you read. Dig into the details, analyze it with a critical mind, and ask yourself, what is the purpose behind this? Who stands to gain, and why is it so important? Now, the classic story that he used to teach us, and I mean, it's ironic because it was the time of the World War, it was Nazi Germany, but it was the claim of how Hitler came to power. Now, when Hitler came to power, there were two acts that he introduced that gave him basically power as a dictator to basically control Germany and do whatever he wanted to do, he could do from there after that date. And the German government and the German people gave that power to him. Now, the reason they gave it to him was because the Reichstag building, which is the German Houses of Parliament, were burnt to the ground. Now, they were burnt to the ground, and the enemy of the time were the communists, the Eastern communists, the people. So they were the Muslims of the time, if you will. And they were considered to be the radicals, and they were the ones that everyone was afraid of. Now, the rumor is that there was a communist radical that was going around, and he burnt the parliament building, right? He set it on fire. Now, the rumors were that the SS, who were basically the most loyal people to Hitler that you'd ever come across, they'd do anything for him. They were the paramilitary wing of the Nazi regime. They saw this happen, and rather than being told to stop, put out the fire, they were told to go around and just pour petrol everywhere to let the building burn. Now, the point being, the next day, Hitler could point at the building and say, look what they've done. You need to give me power so I can protect all of you. Right? So then you ask yourself, well, the account is that communists burned down building. But you ask yourself, who stands to gain the most from that building being burned down? Who stood to gain the most? Now, he's not saying that it's accurate, but he's saying always ask things with an analytical mind. Don't always just take the first bit of truth that's portrayed to you. You have to realize that everyone has, sort of a motive, a desire. Some people have it just to report history. Yes, some people have it just to report facts. But then others do have it to, they have different opinions, different things that they want to portray and things they want to achieve. Now, if I was to ask you, and it's not to humiliate anyone, it's not to belittle anyone, but if I was to ask you what the fundamental thing that people always say about Hamas and their charters, what is it? What is the one thing they always say they want to happen to Israel?
They want to, oh, it's like, when we chant from the river to the sea, they'll just say that is exactly what they want to do. They want to remove us from
Yeah.
it. And yeah, they just basically are fantastic at twisting the narrative.
Well, here's my point. So how many, they say that that's what Hamas want to do. Where have they got that from?
Of course, the media, the Western society.
Where did they got it from? Where does Western media say that that's Hamas's aim? Where's the objective? This is why my history teacher always go back to what he said. Go back to the source, figure out where it's come from. Now, Hamas, they always say it's part of their charter, right? They always say it's their charter. How many people have actually even read their charter? How many people have even seen their two charters? So they have two charters, right? Which is I mean, I'm not trying to insult anyone or anything like that or anyone's intelligence, but a charter basically is the formulative document that governs how an organization or a group of people run. What are their core beliefs? What is their core sort of fundamental point of being? Now, there's the 1988 Hamas Charter. Now, there is differences of opinion in terms of there is violent language and there's things of that nature within that. But there's also very important to understand that the 2017, which is the rewritten charter. Now you have to understand that 1988, there was a lot of emotion, there was a lot of anger, and there was a lot of horrific intent from both sides, genocidal intent from both sides to eradicate the other group because there was so much ill feeling towards each other. There was no question of peace. There was, you stole my land. No, this is our land. We're going to kill you. No, we're going to kill you. It was just awful sort of intention from both sides. So there has been a new sort of, there has been the renewed charter, which clarifies that Hamas's struggle, which is different to the first charter, yes, I'll accept, is not against Jewish people, but against the Zionist movement. It argues that armed resistance to occupation is supported by international law. It also claims to support democracy. And it doesn't refer to the previous charter, but at the same time, it says that Hamas's conflict is with the Zionist project, not the Jews because they are Jewish, but because the Jewish people who support the Zionist project are their enemies. And the point being that you cannot have a homeland for the Jewish people at the expense of the Palestinian people. So it's almost coming towards more of a, sort of middle ground. And within the charter itself, there is the 1988 charter does call for the destruction of Israel. It does. There's no denying that. It does call for that. But within the more renewed charter, you have to understand that there is a clear covenant that separates the struggle against Zionism from general anti-Semitism. So it is, again, as I say, it's not a fight against Zionists for their Jewishness, but because of their illegal project as they see it. And I think that is important because it is a renewed ideology. It is a clarified ideology. It does call for liberation of the Palestinian people from the river to the sea. Now, people obviously take that out of context because they're not taking the charter. They've not read it in the context of what it's written and saying, well, that means the eradication of Israel. No, it doesn't. If you read it in the context of just the 1988 charter, yes, it does. I'd agree with that. You're right. But you have to understand that things of a certain nature and of a certain time change. We were born in 1988. Well, I was born in 1988. I mean, how many things have changed since then? We have iPhones now. We have Wi-Fi. We're talking to each other over Zoom. We've got all these things. How can you possibly compare the founding charter from a group in 1988 to one that has been issued in 2017? There is a call for liberation. There is a call for all these things. You have to understand these things in the context of which they're written. You have to analyze and you have to go to the source. I mean, again, like we said, how many babies was it? 40 babies beheaded? I mean, Biden came out and said he'd seen videos. I mean, you can't say that.
Absolutely ludicrous that a man in the biggest Western nation says that he has seen videos. He is verbally making such a massive accusation, and there's no repercussions whatsoever. Nothing.
And I think that's the point that you're talking about repercussions. That's the point now, right? There is speaking now, obviously it's all well and good pie in the sky us talking about these ideologies and talking about what would be ideal and this thing and that thing. But fundamentally, the reason that now it's become back in the public eye, and I'd say it's lessened even so in the last 6 months, is just because of the scale of the atrocities of what we're seeing. And what shocks me and just appalls me is how it began in terms of, it says Bassem Youssef says, right, how many sons of bitches need to be killed before you suddenly have an issue with it? It's where is the threshold? Where is the point where you suddenly say this is not acceptable? My argument would be that it was from day one. You cannot carpet bomb an entire population for what its people have done. People always talk about, oh, well, look what we did in Dresden in Germany. It's just because something happened previously in a previous life or in a previous conflict doesn't make it right. I mean, for me, I suppose it made more of an impact this time than previous things that I've involved myself with, because having had kids, seeing children of all people, the children, because as has been well published, 50% of the population of Gaza is under 16. How many of those have been killed? How many people have not even seen? I used to sit there, I remember in winter of last year, and just sit there and think, why is my child any special that they should be allowed to go to bed full belly, comfort, nice little blanket, cry because they want X, Y, and Z, where you've got these kids, who are crying their eyes out because they don't even know if they're going to be safe, what's that going off, that bomb, this, that, and the other, they're losing their homes. There are people who had very little in the start, and, they were dealt very poor cards in life in the first place. And then to make things worse, these people can do X, Y, and Z, and no one speaks out about it. No one cares, or it's felt like to me that no one cares. No one does anything. No one's bothered because, how many Palestinians' life is equal to an Israeli life? And it's the fact that the IDF have, and it's not just something that's recent. I mean, they've been doing things like this for years, for decades. I mean,
The
there is,
statistics, when you look at them, like the
it's
chart,
shocking. It's
it's
shocking.
it's sickening and it's harrowing. You mentioned the just the loss of innocent lives, whether that's men, women, children. And actually, what really scares me is that we'll never quite know the true numbers. We'll never know the true reality of what these people have gone through and are going through. And when does it end? To
Well, that's the question.
me,
When does it end?
that's what really petrifies me is that I'm raising children in a world where we're watching this on our screens and there's no end to it
I
from
think that's where the Palestinian people sometimes have lost hope with the rest of us, in the sense that they turn around and say, how much more of us do you need to see killed before you do anything? There's nothing you guys are doing anyway. We don't really care about you guys anymore. There's no
and
point in us even saying anything to you. And to be honest, I think they've got a point. We can only hang our heads in shame, in the sense that, it's still going on. The governments don't seem to care. Governments aren't being held to account. People are lying. I mean, I think our politicians of this day and age they're absolutely appalling. They're all, I mean, this is now me speaking from my own personal opinion, but I think they're all a bunch of liars, and they all just seek to protect themselves and make sure they can benefit from whatever position they hold. I mean, the point that I'm making about the inhumane treatment of all sorts of people. I mean, there's classic examples. There was the World Food Project. I mean, how do you justify that? There was so many things that have happened. But even prior to that, in 2003, I mean, people can go and read about themselves. Rachel Corrie, I think she was an American peace activist, and she was run over and killed by an Israeli bulldozer when she was trying to stop it from bulldozing a Palestinian house. And I mean, she's an American woman. She's not protected. I mean, and the Israeli authorities have no concern about doing that. They do it in the public eye. They don't care.
I mean there was those Western first aid the not first aid the aid workers
The World
that
Food
were
Project, the
killed.
cars.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the World Food Project, yeah. And
Um,
those aren't guys that, you know, are just some random aid workers. They were ex-military, special forces, some of them, I think. So,
they were targeted. I mean their
well,
car was
yeah.
targeted.
Well, there were three cars, so explain how their cars weren't targeted. The first one got hit, they radioed, the second one got hit, and then the third one got hit. I mean, it wasn't as though they all got hit in one go. They got hit systematically, and it just beggars belief. I mean, you're targeting refugee camps, you're targeting this, that, and the other, you're targeting hospitals, you're targeting mosques, you're targeting churches as well. So it's not even a question of, Muslim Jew question. It's a question of what are you even doing? Like how is any of this justified? People, they rely on all sorts of facts and
Mm.
obscure
But
details, but I think it's very important, as I keep saying. I think that's why we wanted to have this in the first place, is to understand the history and the
and
context of all this.
the other thing I wanted to mention, Khurram, was the fact that statistically, again, when you look at the numbers of Palestinian immigrants that have had to move for their own safety over the years and decades, it saddens me to think that over time, they are going to lose their language, their traditions, their culture, their food, because naturally, as you move away
You do, yeah.
from your homeland, as we know, you
Mm,
know, one step further, one generation further, that gap becomes bigger and bigger. And it really saddens
yeah.
me that there's so many third, fourth Palestinian generation that are around in the world that are losing their heritage, I suppose.
I mean, the thing I suppose that, I guess, yeah, I don't know. It's just like the thing that bothers me the most. I mean, I know you're saying that that's what worries you, is that I remember when I was at university, which was, we're talking about December, one of the campaigns, military campaigns that Israel launched into Gaza. I think it was December 2008 into January 2009. We were campaigning and protesting back then, and if you'd asked me then, I was what, maybe early 20s. If by my mid 30s would I think this was still going on? Mid 30s probably seemed like a long time away, but I would have said, nah, no way, it's still going to go on for then. Surely would have fixed it. Surely something would have happened by then. Surely someone would stand up. Surely someone. But it's appalling that these people, they're just almost the forgotten people of the world. It's just unacceptable. I mean, you feel powerless. You try the best that you can, but at the same time, yeah. I mean, it's a bit, what's the word? I feel almost like a sense of poor entitlement, in that I feel entitled enough to say, oh, I feel very hopeless. And it's like, oh, how the hell do I feel hopeless when these people are actually the ones who actually suffer the real hopelessness? But at the same time, I can't help kind of, letting thoughts run away with themselves and think these poor people, such inhumane treatment. I mean, I don't want to be too graphic, but the sexual abuses that you've seen going on against prisoners, the torture that's going on against these prisoners, and it's clear as day, but they're not being held to account. No one seems to want to, say anything. When I say no one, I mean the real powers that could stop
Yeah,
this.
the world leaders seem to be blind to the atrocities, and I'm
I I don't think they're
out.
blind. I think they turn a blind eye to it. I don't think they are blind to it. They know it's going on. They must do. There's no way they can deny it. Surely, if you actually got them behind closed doors and said, "Do you actually think that any of this is not going on? Do you
Like I
actually?"
said to you at the beginning, it's very black and white. There are no grey areas because the evidence is right there. You don't need to look very far to be able to see the evidence. And to touch upon what you were saying earlier about that sense of entitlement, absolutely. If I don't think about Palestinians and their suffering for a day or two, I am full of guilt because I think, gosh, I've spent a whole dinner, I haven't thought about, or I haven't said a prayer, or I haven't done my bit, or I haven't donated for a week. It's all those things, but I guess it's in some ways having these discussions, we hold them in thought and we're doing
Yeah,
our bit to raise awareness. And at this moment in time, if there's one person who listens, who changes their perspective, who, makes a donation or shares their thoughts with another person, that would mean a lot to me because I feel like that's still raising awareness. I'm quite passionate about raising awareness in general.
yeah.
And, I've made one extremely amazing friend who this time last year did not know Palestine existed and did not know about the atrocities that have taken place in Palestine. However, she is now very passionate about not only what's going on in Palestine, but also her perspective on Muslims has changed entirely. And I suppose for me, this is what it's about having this discussion today.
Well, I suppose that's the other thing, right? Is a lot of people have kind of had their eyes open to the resilience of these people and asked where have they got it from. I mean, the countless videos we've seen of people, just relying upon their faith and saying, well, we're okay because, we have faith on our side. We believe that we'll be okay in the long term, and whether that's this life or the next. But
You know
it's still,
something? This is mad, but my journey, I mean, this is me going off on a tangent a little bit, but bear with me. I do think my spiritual journey since last October has changed dramatically. And I think you have to have faith. You have to have faith and hope to know that this is not the end. It cannot be the end. And that actually people who are spreading this torture and hate, they will be punished or they will have consequences, whether it's in this life or the hereafter.
yeah, I think that's fundamentally what you'd have to hope for, wouldn't you? Because I mean, otherwise, I don't know how you can kind of even make peace with what I say make peace, make some sort of semblance of what's going on, because it's just crazy. Like you look at it and it's abhorrent, and it's like I'd like to think that if I was in a position of power, when I say power, I mean real power, to do something, I'd be able to do something about it or would do something about it, because it's just you look at it and you just think how do these people how do they function from day to day? Like all these abhorrent things that we've seen. And I think it's like you said, now with social media, they can't even deny it because people can put videos up straight away of what has happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess there are no words truly. When I say that, I genuinely mean it. There are no truths. That just a heap of emotions that I sometimes really struggle to articulate because it's just too much for one mind to think that we live in a society, in a world that is so cruel, where basic humanity, doesn't really exist, sadly.
Well, I'd caveat that. I'd say you're right in the sense that from what we see, it looks like it doesn't exist. But it's all these, it's when you see that they've not been forgotten, that there's people who are willing to take a stand, there's people who are willing to walk down the streets, there are people who are willing to educate themselves, there are people who are willing to try and open up their mind to it and understand what's going on bit by bit. It's not,
Oh no,
uh,
absolutely.
do you know what I mean? That's,
Oh yeah, I think there are people in their hundreds, if not thousands, if not in their millions, who since October the 7th, 2023, have probably come to know about Palestine, have come to know about the suffering, and are campaigning, are protesting. And I know for a fact there's people in my workplace, Hurum, where they speak very openly about Palestine, and it brings me great joy that humanity does exist. When I say humanity doesn't exist, I meant more so the world leaders,
yeah.
like you said, have the power to make the changes, yet they're choosing not to. And that's what I struggle to understand in
I
terms
think
also the
it's
power dynamic and the
well,
financial aspect. I just struggle to comprehend that really.
it's just that I mean they're absolute. I've got no time for politicians anymore. I used to be of the view that there is things that you can talk about and discuss with X, Y, and Z politician or this that, but I think they're all as bad as each other. They're most of them are just. I mean, I know it's tarring them all with the same brush, but frankly at this point I don't even care. I think they're still cowards. I think they're cowards and all they're interested in is self-preservation. And but yeah,
Is
that's the.
Is there anything that we have missed? Anything that you would like to add? Because it's been an hour and a half and
Oh dear. Feels like to me it's been more of a history lesson, which is what I try to avoid. But at the same time, I think it's
I think
important to
it's
understand.
relevant. I think it's relevant because we could easily have sat here throughout an hour and a half and have these discussions about our thoughts, opinions, and experiences, but that's not what it's about. Anyone can do that. But you have gone out of the way to do your research, put it together to make us better informed. I didn't know about a lot of the things that you've mentioned today, and I was actually tempted to make notes.
Well,
But I will go back and make notes because I want to be better informed and confident when sharing my views.
well, I think that's the point, right? I think a lot of people will question. I mean, because looking at just from a humanitarian perspective, everyone's going to say that. Well, I'd hope to think that most people would look at it and say, this is an injustice, this needs to stop. But then if someone who's from an opposing viewpoint would turn around and use X, Y, and Z fact to say, oh, no, no, this is all completely justified because of, this reason, that reason. If you don't know the history, then you can be caught out. You can be made to look foolish. You can be even made to question whether or not your viewpoint is right. So it is important to read the history. Now, I think the main point that I'm saying at the start is that there are two sides to every story. There are, faults on both sides. There have been episodes and events and things that are inexcusable. People have committed atrocities on both sides. But I think that the point that I would make to everyone is I'm no expert. This is all stuff that I've learned through time, through reading. And I would argue to everyone, don't just believe what you see on social media. Don't just believe what you see in the news. Go to the old school way of doing it. Pick up a book from someone who's actually dedicated their lives to researching the history, to writing about the history. Keep it old school. Read the books. Read the fundamental factual knowledge rather than political satire or political analysis, which has got different intentions, different things behind it. Really get to grips with the history so you understand what you're talking about, how it's gotten to the point is, because otherwise I think you belittle the struggle of these people. And as I say, I'm not here to sort of point the finger at anyone or anything of that nature. It's just a case of, in my heart of hearts, I know that no one deserves to suffer like the Palestinian people are suffering, regardless of what reasoning use or argue for them. Nobody deserves to live a
Regardless
life
of
like that.
faith, background,
It does,
race,
yeah, exactly. None of that matters. I mean,
none of that matters. If there's a soul that's breathing, even the animals, for heaven's sake, like even the animals shouldn't be suffering the way that they're suffering there right now.
it's the whole thing. You look at all these, the children, the displacement, the families, and they want what we have. Like literally, all they want is what we have: healthcare, education, safety, roof over their head, food in their tummies, able to put their children to sleep, knowing that they'll be alive the next day, knowing that they'll see the night through without being bombed to kingdom come. It's just you'd hope that that's a very basic human right that everyone would have, and hopefully there's enough good people left in the world, and I'm sure there are, that will make sure that, like you said, this can't be the end. This can't be how it all finishes. It can't be that these people who have done or committed atrocities on both sides aren't held to account. But at some point, the killing and the repercussions, they have to stop. I mean, look at it just recently, this whole pager incident of, pages going. I mean, at what point is human life going to be respected again? It has to stop. It has to stop. And I think the only way you can do that is, like you say, raise awareness, raise your knowledge, read, educate. I mean, the pen is mightier than the sword, so educate yourselves.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Can I just say, no disrespect to Brummies, but I'm so glad you don't have a Brummie accent because there's no way I could have sat for an hour and a half to you talking in a Brummie accent.
Okay, calm down with your Geordie twang. Uh,
Sorry, that was very discriminatory, wasn't
it
it?
was, it was. It's not fair, not fair to me. But no, no,
But
I
no,
get it.
I'm really, really glad that we managed to talk. And yeah, thank you very much.
No, thank you. I'm hoping, as I say, I hope it wasn't too boring for people in terms of as a history lesson. I'm just
Well,
hoping that
it's
people
their
can.
problem, not an us problem, Hurum.
Well, it will be when they start listening to this and sending you messages, be like, "Can we not have any more of these podcasts, please? Can we have can we have something a bit more lighthearted?"
Oh, well, they've got plenty of other episodes to choose from, so,
It's good.
I think we did good.
I hope so. I hope, if anything, that at least, like you say, one person goes away with having learned something or
Yeah,
being able to ask a question and find out more
yeah.
about it.
For me, it's always about that one person, just the one person, and I'm content. And actually, at this moment in time for him, it's not even about that one person. I feel really happy that me and you managed to take time and speak for such a long period of time about on a subject that really matters. But yeah, no, thank you so much. And I do, on a side note, I do hope it is useful to people that listen. Thank you.
No worries.